take us through the main presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So we have a good morning for DC, New York, Denver. We have a good afternoon for South Sudan, Tanzania, Namibia, Nigeria, London, Amsterdam, and Germany. And we have a good evening for India. Early this morning, we had also the Asia presentation, and I presented a lot of the examples that I will talk about. Now I will focus more on Africa. This morning, I focused more on the Asia examples. So thank you for joining us today to discuss one of the largest unspoken problems of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is how do we finance the sanitation target. I will talk about what we know, and it's easy to address, what we know, and it's difficult, and to be very honest also about the things that we still do not know. I'll aim to stick to my 15-minute mark, so we have enough time for discussion. And we're quite a lot, so that will be good. So I will start with what we know, and it's easy. We know that reaching the sanitation sustainable development goals is going to cost a lot, and it's not where you think it's going to cost a lot. Most of the cost estimates in the sector, especially for sanitation, are focusing on the construction of infrastructure, and they actually revolve around three topics. Most of the discussions in the sector at the moment are about discussions about the cost of sewage versus the centralized systems, about appropriate technologies, about low-cost technologies, high-tech technologies, and everything else in between. We also talk a lot about the whole sanitation chain, from collection to treatment to reuse. And then there's the discussions about behavioral change, promoting private sector, creating markets, and the demand for infrastructure, demand for latrines, and how much households can pay or not for it. These three discussions are quite important, but they are at the tip of this iceberg. They are still about construction costs, which we call capital expenditure. The major financial discussions we need to start having in the sector actually revolve around the bottom of the iceberg. They revolve around the need for major irregular maintenance, replacement of old infrastructure, and even more important, the cost of the people that actually ensure that services are provided, regulation is enforced, that there is policy monitoring, and other costs also included are the costs of borrowing. I want to make this very concrete. I want to bring you a concrete example. This is southwest Ethiopia, district of South Ari. It takes 2 days to get there by plane and car. The rural population and peri-urban is about 250,000 people, which are served by basic latrines. There's only 7,500 households with improved latrines, which cover about 10% of the population. And this is Omo Gurderso. Omo is part of a 12-people team at district level in South Ari that has to ensure that adequate water and sanitation to the 250,000 people in the district, so that the 250,000 people have services. His salary is paid for, but between him and the rest of the team, they have one motorcycle, which is mostly used by the head of the department to go and come back from the office to his meetings. He has no allowances to leave the office, neither his colleagues, unless an NGO or a program come to visit. And he has no possibility to monitor or follow up on the infrastructure that's being built. Omo is part of what we call the direct support. So a recap. Basically, in every single financing discussion, we do need to take 6 costs into consideration. And this is a good framework for those of you that don't handle finance. You keep an eye for this 6 costs, because if you don't have, especially that bottom of the iceberg, you will have sustainability issues. So CAPEX for infrastructure constructions, which is short for capital expenditure. Operational expenditure, a short OPEX for minor maintenance. Capital maintenance expenditure for large and irregular maintenance. This includes also for sanitation, for instance, pit emptying. Direct support for all the people in the institutions which are directly involved in the service provision. And Omo will need to have more than his salary to actually ensure that the CAPEX that goes into his district is maintained by having a little bit of money for going out to the areas and check if things are working, if people are using the latrines, if they are being emptied, etc. None of that exists. And the indirect support for the costs at regional and national level, the regulators, the planners, many of you in the call would probably fall under the category of indirect support. And finally, when there are loans that need to be paid back, the cost of capital. And for larger loans, this might actually be more of a larger proportion than you think of the overall cost to the sector. So we also know the scale of the challenge. There's less details for sanitation, but there are quite a lot of sources. Once you get my presentation, all of the underlines and the links, all the sources are linked. You can find them. They come from different sources. The first one comes from the World Bank, the latest report on costing the sector. And so to reach the SDG 6, both water and sanitation, will require at least $114 billion a year for capital expenditure only, capital investments, infrastructure, the tip of the iceberg. And that is 3 times more of what is being currently spent. 8, or ODA, reached merely $18 billion a year in 2014, but it is still very important for many countries, but it's also decreasing. So you see, it's a small portion compared with the overall financing gap. Capital maintenance, large repairs, estimated to be at least 1.5 times the amount needed for the construction of infrastructure. So one of the biggest parts of our iceberg is 1.5 times the $114 billion US dollars. I didn't put it in numbers because it just gets to very, very large amounts, which are difficult to understand. We also know by comparing the budgets of some countries, but there is not much data on this, is that the absolute minimum for direct support is about $1 per person per year for rural water and sanitation. We don't know how much is required for this enabling environment or direct support for sanitation only. We also know that as coverage increases, the cost of the enabling environment become increasingly important. At the bottom of the x-axis, we have the coverage rates, and on the y-axis are the sector effort and costs. As coverage increases, more is need to be spent on the capital maintenance, which is that part in reds, and on the direct and indirect support, which is in blue. If there are no changes in the expenditure, there is a stagnation in coverage between 60 and 80%, and this was done mainly for water. So as countries pump more investments into infrastructure, and you fail to get more money to people like OMO to actually follow up and to be able to maintain the existing infrastructure, the failure rate is higher than the coverage rate, which actually starts flatlining or decreasing. And then for this seminar, I actually tried to do it specifically for sanitation for both urban and rural. Let me just go, this was the Asia countries, I just go to the African countries. So what starts happening, in water, we are seeing all the countries that I looked at had an increase in the investments for sanitation. And what you see is that the countries are decreasing or flatlining. Not all of them, they're success cases. So I'm just showing you a few examples. This one is for urban sanitation. And I want to show you in this specifically slide, you have flatlining and decreasing at lower levels of coverage, both for Rwanda, Zambia, and the one line going all the way up is Tanzania. So there are some success cases, the others not. And for rural population, you see also quite a lot of flatlining and decreasing, with an immense increase in Rwanda and some good attempts in Zambia and in Kenya, for instance. So this is the part that what we know and it's easy, and now we move to what we know and it's difficult. Well, we know that there's limited sources of finance for water and sanitation. I told you about the 6 cost components you need to know, and the other thing that you need to know is that there's only 3 sources of finance to cover those costs. As most of you know this. These are the treaties from OECD, So tariffs paid by consumers, one source of funding the cost, taxes paid by citizens at national or local level and then distributed to sector budgets, and transfers, international aid. There's also some countries which are lucky enough to have their own resources, mostly natural resources. Those are not here. And then there's the large financing gap. What we want is the sector to be able to decrease the finance gap by increasing their very low tariff system, increased taxation that is redirected to the sector, and as we are seeing the transfers and aid declining. Now, the difficult part is that we need to know, to be able to do this, we need to know how much do we have. So that's that first column. Then how much do we actually need to reach target 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030? And then what mechanisms we will use from funding to cover those costs. This is very interesting because it seems simple enough, but from this year, from 75 respondents to the WHO GLAAS report, only 8 countries have reported implementing consistently sector development investment plans. And these were, for your information, because I had to ask, Guinea, Botswana, Cote d'Ivoire, India, Panama, South Africa, Uzbekistan, and Venezuela. And even more dramatic, only 4 countries actually have cited using multi-year budgets or expenditure frameworks and indicated that these plans are agreed and consistently followed. For urban sanitation, there were Albania, Senegal, Mali, and Pakistan. So the question we need to start asking ourselves, instead of keep saying, oh, we don't have enough data to track progress in the sector, is why is it so difficult? Why is it so difficult to have multi-year sector expenditure frameworks? They do exist in other countries in other sectors in these countries, and for health, for energy. So there are people in the countries with the capacity to actually do them. We also know that there are high inequalities in access to water and sanitation compared with water and hygiene. This is from the latest GMP report, which also points out to inequalities between countries, between regions in each country, between urban and rural, by wealth quintiles, and for different minority religions or castes within the countries. I have attended last month a very interesting meeting about inequalities or tracking inequalities for water and sanitation in Europe, organized by WHO. These issues are actually quite complex to address also within Europe, but I wanted to share with you the tool that WHO has developed, so a scorecard method to be used at national and decentralized levels, and I highly recommend it. Again, the link and the hyperlinks are in the presentation. So this is what we know, but what is difficult is that to address these inequalities, we need to change the pattern in the expenditure, and this is quite difficult because who's responsible is it to address the people that are most excluded? Which agencies? Which mechanisms? Again, the WHO scorecards allow to go deeper into these issues, and I just put you a slide. I'm not expecting you to read any of it, just to mention that the latest World Bank report on poverty diagnosis has a lot of wealth of data on specific countries of what these inequalities are. So this is also we know, and it's difficult to address. Final slide on this. Last week I was at the Water Institute conference in North Carolina, and this was a very interesting slide that Clarissa presented based on the interaction with finance ministers that he attended the high-level meeting earlier this year. So it will be very difficult to change the expenditure allocations within each at national level without data, and worse, without showing progress. I mean, if you were a finance minister or part of her or his technical team, and you can see that you are increasing year after year, you're increasing investments on one hand. On the other hand, you see those graphs that I showed earlier with stagnating or even decreasing access. And you really would be reluctant to invest more in the sector. And finally, we go to the unknown. So if tariffs and public finance, the tariffs and public finance which are available are not of the volumes that you need and are not coming in fast enough to address the finance gap, what do you do? How do you go about it? Well, the same way that you need to buy a house or a car or throw a big wedding, you borrow. So we bring in private finance. This is from the blended finance report launched by the World Bank also at this summer. So there's two types of private finance. The first one is concessional finance, which basically has usual lower interest rates and a grace period. For instance, you only need to start paying back the loan in 10 years. And the other one is more the commercial finance standard, with standard high interest rates and short repayment periods. So either way, this is debt and it needs to pay back. This is what's important to know. This is a very simplified slide, and the reality is much more complex, as there are many combinations of how you bring public and private finance in different mechanisms, which are called blended finance. So what I want to give you, this is my final and most important slide, I want to give you a tool and a framework to start asking the right questions about this and to feel confident to talk about this. So what we actually don't know is what financing options are really available to reach the finance gap in each of the countries. Why is that? So for each type of finance available, we need to understand what we're talking about. For each new finance silver bullet, we need to question its true outreach. And so here you see, I want to guide you through this diagram. On the x-axis, we have the amount of risk for paying back loans. AAA, so if you start on the lower left side, AAA is low risk. It's a high credit rating, usually matching with your top country high-performing utilities, typically urban utilities. Then we go to C credit rating in the middle of the diagram, and this means higher risk, which is typical of the centralized providers, less well-performing utilities, more small-town type of utilities, or fast-growing rural areas. On the right side of the slide, there is high risk. There's no credit rating. This is the spectrum where there's no formal utility providers usually, and there's mainly operated by the centralized providers. On the y-axis, we have the amount of finance required. So a couple of important points I want to make here. The first one is that at the moment, a lot of the finance available for sanitation, so bond financing, the purple area, project financing, the dark yellow, commercial financing, the red, these are all the equivalent of Rolls-Royce side of financing spectrum. This is sophisticated. They are very sophisticated. They require proper governance systems, high efficiency of utilities, proper regulation, developed financial markets. So there's a lot of criteria that many countries have at the moment to be able to attract this side of the private finance. The second important thing to know is that all of these finance mechanisms require some form of match from public finance, and that's why you see the blue going all around. All of them require public finance. And why? Because we basically have to reduce the risk for the private investors and make the sector attractive enough. So the more we move to the right side of the diagram, where there is more risk, the more public finance will be needed. And this is also where most of the poor that don't have access to services fall into. The third and final point on this slide is that in most wealthy countries, universal sanitation coverage was actually achieved through a combination of public, private, capital, and tariffs. And therefore, for most low and middle income countries, there are two possible approaches to finance sanitation, and none of them is rocket science. Approach number one is to redistribute funds from other sectors. This is essential. Governments have to increase the budget allocation to sanitation from existing budgets, but as I mentioned before, unless you're able to check how much money you have, how much money you need, and show progress, this will be very difficult. Approach number two is to increase local and national tax revenue. So such taxation must be equitable, so you can't simply increase the tax burden on low-income citizens. But both approaches will require that funds are spent efficiently, but also ensuring that the money goes into the bottom part of the iceberg, the enabling environment, the people, the institutions, and not only into construction of infrastructures. So my time is up. Many of the issues I have talked about are in this paper that we have done for the high-level panel at the World Bank Spring meetings. I have also made a selection of key resources from this year. They are all excellent. I highly advise you to read them. And this is my email if you have any further questions. And then I have a couple of questions. We will go through the conversation box, and the questions will be moderated by Nelson that I'm handing over to. And I'll put the final slide on possible questions for discussion. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Katarina. And this is a really great presentation, and you have done us a great service by making sure that you expose us to all these issues, and it's really a moment that we can now begin to relate and probably discuss some of the issues that you have raised in this particular presentation, and that's the main purpose of this webinar today, Lily. And you have articulated a number of possible questions for us to discuss, and I think they are quite on spot, very important questions for us, Lily, to reflect on. The first question you are asking us is to probably think and look at whether we recognize some of these problems, at least from our countries or where we work. And you are also asking us to reflect on what we think are the constraints to understanding existing expenditures at different levels. That's quite a very important question. And the third one is, what are the constraints to develop sector financing strategies? So this is something that I think is very important as we work together, maybe collaboratively. What do we see in our countries to be the main constraints to develop the sector financing strategies? And of course, the last one is an interesting one, leaving no one behind. That's, I think, something that we say all the time. But you are asking, but it will take time. That's the point. So it's a question of say, will it take more time, or it's just a political decision that has got no reality at all? These are things that I think we have to be looking at in this particular presentation. In this particular webinar, and thank you for this presentation again. I have been monitoring also the charts. So far there are no questions yet, but as I mentioned, we have quite a lot of time today to really discuss this issue of sanitation financing. And I would rather say feel free to take up the mic at the time that you would like to make a contribution or an intervention, but at the same time also feel free to drop your comments in the chat box. It could also be questions. I mentioned that I would say a little bit more about Katarina, because this is something that I should have done at the beginning, but I didn't want to overload you with information. Katarina Fonseca is an economist leading the innovation and international program of the IRC, and she has been at the IRC for some time, since 2000 actually, coordinating financing and cost recovery themes. Since 2008, she has been working as WASH Cost Project Director. The WASH Cost is a 5-year initiative funded by Bill and Melinda Gates, and has worked with countries to identify the long-term costs of sustainable rural and peri-urban water and sanitation services. She is at the moment, as I mentioned, I think at the beginning, leading or heading innovation and international program at IRC. And I also mentioned that she has done quite a lot of blogs. Blogs is, I think, what my colleague in Tanzania would say. She has done a lot of blogs on issues of financing post-2015. I see there is a comment already from John Oldfield. I think if you don't mind, John, I would rather give you a bit of a space to just ask this question. Probably sometimes chat can be limiting and you don't probably give background. So feel free to take over the mic. And those of us also who would like to make a comment would be happy to take maybe several comments or questions, and then allow Katarina to reflect on those issues that you might have raised. So over to you, John, and whosoever that may follow afterwards.
Yeah, Nelson, thank you very much. John Goldfield here from Washington, D.C. Katarina, great presentation. I'm concerned that about both public and private finance across the developing world. There's a lot of that on the sidelines right now, and that could potentially fill up a big chunk of the missing need. What more can the donor community do to make it possible for commercial banks in Kenya, in India, wherever, to put more of their local capital in local currency to work in the water and sanitation sector? I specifically used USAID's Development Credit Authority as an example of a donor that facilitates the mobilization of local private capital. But it's really tricky to get these credit risk guarantees functioning to slightly reduce the risk in developing countries. So just wondering if there's something that the sector is not doing that could get to those billions and maybe even trillions of dollars.
Great, many thanks, John, for that comment and question. And we'll have to take a couple of maybe comments or questions and then allow Katrina to respond to one moment. So this is the first set of questions that we're taking now. I see already a hand from Jonah. I like the innovation, Jonah. You are saying you are raising your hand. Please go ahead, Jonah.
Hi everyone. Thanks for the presentation. Really good insights. I hope you can hear me. You mentioned that especially sanitation lags behind when it comes to inequalities. And I wonder if there are any first suggestions or first approaches on how to balance that sanitation, balancing with access to water and hygiene. Thanks, that's it.
Many thanks, Jonah. And I see a couple of other questions as well, or points raised by Dennis, and there is also Andre, and I think it would be very fair for us to allow a little bit more discussion and of course hear the voice. I would say yes, we have taken note of the question in the chat, but I think let's hear you, Dennis, say something to this point that you have raised, in case there is also a little bit of background that you'd want to give to the question as well. Dennis?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Good. Well, within this very good discussion by Katerina, there was no mention about small loans and small microfinance being part of the overall sector approach. And I'm just wondering, to what extent can microfinance loans be part of this solution? And these loans might originate from banks set up specifically for that. Alternatively, they can be originated by self-help groups in small rural communities, which put together their own microfinance program to help their individual members.
Great. Many thanks for that point, Dennis, and I think it's quite a good point you've raised, a good question you've raised. I think to just allow Katrina put her responses together, we'll still get some few more questions, and I think I see a hand. I'll have to jump one or two people because I see quite a number of other points also raised in the chat here. But Leslie, I think Leslie, can you come in here to ask your question, and then we'll also allow Andre to just maybe give your comment and maybe a question as well, and probably a little bit of background to what you have raised in the chat here. But let's first hear Leslie.
Yeah, thank you, Sitali. Can you hear me? Just to confirm.
Yes, please, 100%.
Wonderful. Well, and I'm Leslie Borges from water.org, and actually we've been working closely with IRC and Katerina on some of these issues. I was going to respond to Dennis Warner's sort of reflection or comment insofar as microfinance is concerned. If you want to collect more questions, by all means do that, or I can speak, one or the other.
All right. I'm just I'm just hoping that we didn't miss you at some point. You gave a very good laughter, which we appreciate, but you also, we kind of like lost you. But is that all, or you don't want to add something?
Oh no, I'm sorry. I wanted to speak to Dennis Warner's.
Fabulous, thank you so much. So I think then you have made Katrina's work a little bit easier in that regard. Many thanks, Leslie. Yes, it's very important. Okay, thank you. Do you want us to continue, or we can give a chance to others at this point?
Nelson, please. Otherwise, it's complicated for me to read my own handwriting.
I get you. I understand your point. So at this point, before we get to hear from Andre, let's hear Katrina to respond to these ones, and then we'll get another round of comments and questions. I'm also sure that, Katrina, you're keeping an eye in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm trying to group also some of them. So I will attempt my first three. So the first one was from John on what can be the role of the donor community. And I think there's three main areas, actually not just for the donor community, but a lot for yeah. So the first one is that I don't think there should be, it's a simple tip. I don't think there should be any presentation, anywhere in the world on the SDG 2030, which does not have money in it. Having discussions on anything from technologies to demand creation without having the full scope of where does it fit within the financing gap makes no sense. I mean, this is a first. And I keep seeing many of them, especially in sector conferences. The second one is that we keep talking about, well, there's lack of data, we don't have financial data, track famed initiative of WHO, it's so hard to get the data, etc. And I think we need to start addressing the root causes of not having the financial data, of the sector not being able to have financing strategies. And there was a comment on that as well, that sanitation is that in most countries there is not a sector financing strategy for sanitation, and the GLAAS data, WHO data also confirms that. The second one is that, I actually go back to my slide. What can we do? Well, I mean, as I mentioned, most of these financing mechanisms and blended finance are not available to most of the countries that need it the most, because there's a lot of governance criteria and financial criteria that they don't meet. And I think the donors can work on the governance issues to try to decrease the risk for private finance to come in, but at the same time work on raising the public finance for the sector. So this has to be a parallel work. Then there was the question on inequalities, and I was asked for an example of success of lower middle income country of financing sanitation. I mean, I think the best and the case that I'm most familiar with, because I worked quite a lot with them, is Bangladesh. I mean, and you can see it also in the official data. You see, it's very interesting actually to compare Bangladesh and India. Too bad our colleagues from WaterAid India left already. But so you see also in India with the sanitation tax, an increase in the investments for the sector, but you cannot see yet the increase in coverage. So there's still a flat line in the data available. In Bangladesh, it was a political decision. It had complete political backup. It had one of the largest NGOs in the world, if not the largest in the water sector, putting and making use of this myriad of financing mechanisms that you see here, and especially to address this lower right end, where are the poor, and really the localized microfinancing, but also adding public finance to the mixture, adding quite sophisticated commercial bank financing as well. So, but it was because it was a political decision. It was not because we finally had the money to reach the poor. And this is, for me, one of the best examples, and you can see it in the data as well. The challenge now is going to expand some of those successes to urban sanitation. I don't know if most of you know Dhaka and other cities in Bangladesh, and they have a serious problem and a serious financial problem to address. And this leads to the final question on microfinance. Microfinance is there. It's called microloans. So we focus on the mechanism. So microloans are indeed one of the few mechanisms that address that part of the spectrum of financing where there's no credit rating, higher risk, the centralized providers. But if you see and as Leslie was also mentioning and someone else, the amount of finance provided is quite small and localized. So this will not be able to address even the medium to large sewage systems, the centralized sewage systems. I mean, not even treatment plants. No way we can reach that with microfinance. It has an important role to play, as all the other financing mechanisms have. So it's one of the pieces of the puzzle. And I think now I have another 5 minutes to read more of the question.
Yes, definitely quite a lot of moments to read. But surely the idea is to make it as interactive as possible. And my colleagues have been able to draw my attention to the fact that we didn't get to hear much from Leslie. And I would really want to get back to her in order to just make a further comment to what Dennis had mentioned. And this, of course, has been touched on by Katrina just right now, but it could also be good to hear the voice from Leslie. And so sorry that I think earlier on we couldn't hear you well, but let's give it a go again here, Leslie. And the question from Dennis was, to what extent is microfinance important in sector financing? And I think this is something that we got to hear from you as well. Leslie?
Yeah, thank you, Sitali. Yes, so Water.org focuses very strongly on financial solutions for water and sanitation access to the poor at the household level. And the main mechanism that we've been working through up until now is microfinance. So I completely agree with Katarina that microfinance is not something that would be supportive of large-scale infrastructure, et cetera, but that's where the focus of a lot of efforts and funding does currently go. But then, you see a lot of countries such as India, that want to move, sanitation access to, nearly 100%, meet their SDG. But then they end up having to fund a lot of that access themselves. And what the approach that we've taken through microfinance is actually ensuring that the poorer families can access these micro loans, so they can construct the toilet that they actually want, which in some cases is not just many cases is not the simple basic toilet that a government might install in someone's home or their backyard. But they might be aspirational, and they want them to be nice, or they want them to have spaces where they can shower, etc. Because for people, that's, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. So it builds into their aspirations, not as just poor people who are beneficiaries of government projects, but as actual consumers and contributors to the local economy. And I think in so many cases, everyone just thinks that everyone is equally poor, but there's a huge spectrum across who is really, across poor and who is below the poverty line. And there is definitely, we don't pretend that microfinance will work for everyone in that spectrum. The poorest of the poor are always going to need that help from the governments, from others. But we do think if you adjust the loan terms, et cetera, to accommodate the market, then that's can be a substantial portion of the population that is now self-financing. And what this does is it frees up a lot more of that public government money or donor money to be more strategically targeted. And we know from all of the conversations that have been led by the World Bank, UNICEF, et cetera, since the SDGs have been out there, everyone talks about using available funding more efficiently, right? And so this is one way to do that. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, and the viable, the sort of potential market that this has is going to vary, between country to country, and it's also going to be dependent on the strength of their existing market systems. Katarina called out Bangladesh. We also have been active in Bangladesh for a long time, but that's of course where microfinance originated back in the 90s, right? So, you know, South Asia in particular is very strong in this. It's not necessarily as developed and robust in other countries around the world. So it's one very important part of the solution, as Katarina was saying, that has the potential to really sort of to make a lot of change, to make a lot of impact. I mean, water.org in India alone this year, our financial partners have dispersed over 1 million loans, which is substantial. And some of our Southeast Asia, they've also, collectively been able to do that as well, and that's a newer program. So there is interest, there is demand, and the problem is that the market doesn't see lending for water and sanitation as a viable source, as a reliable source of revenue. And I think that's where some of our work, really lays, is sort of shifting these perceptions. I would also say, building on, and other people can probably contribute to this in other ways or more substantive ways, but one area in terms of not necessarily, sort of microfinance, but is the sort of assistance that a lot of groups are, from the philanthropic side, from the bilateral donor side, or the World Bank, are contributing right now, is they're working closely with a lot of small water and sanitation utilities, trying to build up their internal capacity so that they are creditworthy. Water.org has been doing this, but there's a lot of other programs like USAID, the World Bank, and I'm assuming others that are very invested in this field right now. Because, again, as long as water and sanitation is considered not profitable and not no good return, when it's not perceived as having good returns, you don't have that level of investment. And we do need, as a sector, as a sector, we really need to see this as a marketable business and not just a public health problem that governments have to solve with the assistance of donors. So I think that requires a huge shift in thinking on all of our parts. And I'll wrap it up here.
Great. Thank you so much, Leslie, for that intervention. I think you are offering quite a lot of insights from the water.org, and the experiences that you have articulated here are really helpful, and I'm sure we'll be following up on some of these. You are offering some of the solutions and perspectives that are quite important, particularly when we deal with the issues of financing, and especially when we also try to address issues of different maybe stratas or people at different levels of poverty as well. So the realities that you have unpacked are quite interesting for us as well. Just to maybe allow also others to comment, I feel it could be fair for us to also hear from Ananda. I think Ananda from Sri Lanka, if you can pick up the mic. I don't want to be unfair to Andre, but I've seen that Andre's question is quite clear, so I'm sure that Katrina has taken note of that. And I'll also allow a little bit of more time for Peter Mahal from South Sudan to probably give us a little bit of more reflections as well. You have, of course, dropped the question in the chat box, but in case you'd like to just give a little bit of context to that, you'll have the space to do that after Ananda. Ananda, go ahead, please. Oh, it appears, Ananda, we cannot hear you unless maybe you are muted. You may have to unmute your mic, but we'll give you a chance to do that. Meanwhile, as you work on that, Ananda, let's hear from Peter. Peter Mahal from South Sudan. Peter?
Yes, good morning to you, Nelson, and presenter, Katerina. The question I raise is here that, yes, that's very thoughtful input that have been presented by IRC, and talking of the tariffs and looking for mobilization of resources from the public, private sector, bringing the microfinancing on board to address the issues of sanitation. These are very fantastic ideas, strategies, but I was asking a question that there are some countries that are affected with the conflict, like our case. Some are affected with some natural disasters, and the focus of those countries plus the development partners have shifted mostly on the addressing issues of peace and bringing peace as the priority, and trying to bring all the resources that are being mobilized or already were for development. They have been shifted. They have to address the issues of life saving. So, and we are talking of the development agenda, this sanitation and hygiene, provision of safe drinking water. All these issues are developmental issues, and it would be very difficult for us who are working in this sector to convince both sides that why not looking into these issues. So I was asking, what are some of the thoughtful ideas or creative ideas that could address the issues of both the humanitarian aspect that is going on, plus these issues of development? Some strategies and thoughtful ideas that can bring the two moving together. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Peter. This is quite a very good comment, and looking at how to address issues, especially for countries that are in conflict or emerging from conflict or disasters. And I think you will get a reflection pretty soon. But I'd like to get back to Ananda from Sri Lanka and see whether you still have the chance to speak at this moment, Ananda. Oh gosh, looks like we're not likely to get to Ananda. But then I would also probably, instead of Ananda, get to hear a comment, still from Sri Lanka in this case. The name here is Ahajawera. Sorry if I pronounce it wrongly, but Ahajawera, if you have a chance to probably pick up the mic and articulate a little more the 2 points that you have raised, and maybe give us a little bit of the context in the case of Sri Lanka, that could be helpful. Ah, okay. I'm getting information that this could also be that it is Ananda from Sri Lanka. Sorry if I mixed up the names here. It does appear that we are not likely to hear the voice from Sri Lanka in this case. We'll still see whether we could have the opportunity to hear from Sri Lanka. But there are a number of other comments in the chat that I think we can allow Katrina to reflect on again and maybe share with us some perspectives, including what we have just heard from Peter here. Katrina, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Nelson. Thank you for all the questions. So I will first address the question of Andres, of if there's any thoughts on the funding needed for urban sanitation versus rural sanitation. What we know is that if we look at the 6 cost components, for urban sanitation, the component of capital expenditure, the cost of the infrastructure, and the cost of actually managing those assets, so capital maintenance, the replacement, the preventive maintenance, those will be much higher than in rural. But in rural, because there's not one utility providing a service, you will need a lot more of this support to the district and the decentralized authorities to actually make sure that the services are being provided, that regulation is being enforced, etc., monitoring, reporting. Then in rural, the direct support will be a higher proportion of the costs. And this is usually ignored. In the utility component, this is usually the staff time, and in the utility environment, there would be part of OPEX, of operational expenditure. So it's more that the different cost components would have different weights in the full cost picture. Then on the points of Peter on the conflict and disaster areas, this is also quite interesting. I have worked for 3 years with UNHCR and we developed successfully a costing tool, and we were able to develop a dashboard, which is part of the UNHCR reporting system, and also to try to collect all of these costs in this reporting tool, especially the four main ones: CAPEX, OPEX, capital maintenance, and the equivalent of direct support, which is in this case is the salaries of 8 staff. And the interesting part, the things that we found, is that one, the level of sophistication of data available is much higher because it's centralized. It's the 8 agencies, the emergency institutions who are collecting this data. And they do include all of these costs. And because of that, it's very interesting to understand that actually, and they are all 8. So there's all private, either philanthropists or 8 agencies. And the costs per person are much higher than the financing at the moment of development programs, which makes sense because we're talking about life saving. And then Peter was asking about specific strategies, and I was thinking specific cases. The one that came to my mind was South Korea. So South Korea was pretty devastated with the war, and they were able to have universal or almost universal coverage to sanitation in 1 generation. And how did they do it? Well, first they had political leadership at the highest level. This was really the president, the prime minister. So we're talking beyond ministers of finance. This was really a high leadership priority. So that was first. Then aid. There was quite a lot of aid to reconstruct and to rebuild the country. And then there was the ability of some of the larger utilities and municipalities to start providing decent services. So the people that could pay for it were actually paying it back. And then there was a cross-subsidization. And what also Leslie and others were talking about, of having some of these utilities actually becoming efficient to the point of reducing the risk to attract private capital. And if they are able to attract the private capital and pay back their loans, then this also releases the public funds for those areas that are not able to do this. And I think a concrete tip maybe for the colleagues in South Sudan and other countries would be to start facilitating this finance discussion. And I see there's some colleagues on the line as well, with the government. So be really trying to understand the constraints to develop financing strategies, to have numbers on the table, get to the bottom of it. If we know that all the countries have committed to the SDG in 2030, what kind of level of service are we able to provide with the money that we have? What is feasible? What is the phased approach feasible to attract additional finance? So these were, and I was also really interested to understand more about the revolving fund in Sri Lanka. I will definitely investigate that a little bit further. Thank you for the tip.
Many thanks, Katrina, for these interventions and contributions, and especially in response to the comments that we have heard earlier on. And I see that there are quite a number of other questions in the chat. I'm not so sure, Katrina, if you would have maybe chance just to let to some of these. But before you do that, I realized that we normally plan the webinars to run for 1 hour. So we have just gone past the hour mark. And in this particular regard, I would like to say, those of us who would like really to stay on, let's do stay on and have a discussion maybe for another 20 or so minutes. But for those of us who probably committed to join the webinar only for 1 hour, let's feel free to drop off at this particular point in time. But we really would like to appreciate the fact that you spared the moment to join this particular webinar. It's quite interesting, raising very interesting issues on issues to do with the financing the sanitation target. And at this point, I think as we continue with the conversation, we would like to make sure that at least we have addressed most of the points that have been raised in the chat. And I would like to apologize that I mentioned earlier on Ananda to probably make an intervention. I didn't realize that there was also a contribution that was made by Ananda in the chat already, so that's pretty in order. Katrina, probably there are a number of points from Andre here, from John Garrett. There are also comments from ABC. I'm not so sure if you would like to come back to these, and another point from Kim Lim. We cannot hear you, Katrina. Assuming you are talking, it could be that you have muted the mic.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just going through the questions again. I did answer the question of Kim with the microfinance. To fill. So no, is there enough financing in sanitation specific microloans to fill in the gap? No, not really. And there was, so it's the point of AVC. I don't know who that is, but it mentions that in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos, very often one financing constraint is that most governments do not have sanitation, wastewater policies and strategies, and indeed, and my point on this, and I'm motivating all the colleagues from the UN agencies, from the governments. There's a lot of very interesting, I can mention some of there's very interesting initiatives from UNICEF on public finance, WHO, TRACFIN on tracking finance, the GMP, which are all the data on inequalities, and with the World Bank on the big finance discussion, but also of the role that CSOs can have in raising and facilitating some of these discussions among their country governments. So instead of asking for more public finance, which, by the way, we need desperately, but it's more in trying to understand, why don't we have financing strategies for the sector? What is the problem? Can we get that done? Because sometimes it's simply human failure and the inability to bring the right people to the table to have these conversations. And I think we all have a role to play in that, including also the civil society organizations, to start having some of this, to be more confident in having these finance discussions. It is not rocket science. I try to give some very simplified tools to be able at least to ask the right questions. And it's okay. It's okay to admit that we don't know what we don't know. So I don't know. And there was a link. I was trying to open it also from some GRET on financing small water and rural electrification enterprises.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Katrina. And I think something that emerged in the webinar area, which I thought maybe was interesting, is something that probably you can also probably highlight here. And this is about the role of the civil society organizations in sector financing. I think there were quite a number of interesting stories that you had shared on in terms of what can the civil society do, what can the media do. Is this something that probably you'd like also to just to share with us in this webinar? At least it could be interesting.
Yes, let me just go to the one slide. Yes, it's this one. Yes, at 6 in the morning, I definitely had other examples than I have now. But it was, so I was mentioning on addressing inequalities and facilitating some of this discussion on finance. I attended last month's meeting organized by WHO in Budapest for discussing these issues in Europe. And what surprised me was that in France, in Hungary, in Moldova, in a lot of the countries present, and we had ministries of health mainly present, they had delegated this role of applying this the access scorecard and convening the stakeholders to start discussing financing inequalities. This was done by CSOs. It was done by civil society organizations, and in one country it was actually the Association of Journalists, and in another one was a women's association. They were the ones facilitating this discussion, and they were basically allies of the technocrats, so to say, of the technocrats of the governments, to be able to start raising some of these discussions and bringing more to the political realm. For instance, the outskirts of Paris also have quite large inequality issues and financing of these. And the agencies, when we start applying the scorecard, it was clear that many of them knew there was a problem, but they thought it was someone else's responsibility to solve it. And I think sometimes we might be facing the same in the water sector. And so there is a role for civil society organizations, which is to be an ally to the government to bring these discussions to the table.
Great. Many thanks, Katrina. That's quite great and good to hear those perspectives. I see here that John is about to leave, and I wondered, John, if you'd still want to just make a comment, knowing that you have done quite a lot of also work related to sector financing, particularly from the World Trade perspective side, or if it's not you, then maybe Andre, you do maybe want to relate with your experiences as well. It could be quite great to hear maybe from either you, Andre, or John. But you have mentioned that he has left. So, Andre, let's hear from you on this particular occasion then.
Can you please repeat what exactly do you want me to?
Yes, so I said that you mentioned earlier on, in fact it was a question, but we thought that maybe you can also share some perspectives from your experience when it comes to sanitation financing. The question was noted, but we also thought maybe there could be some experiences or contributions that you can share in relation to sanitation financing.
Thanks. I mean, it's not a strong area of expertise, but like my comment really was to try to, and I think Katrina spoke to it, but I think it's kind of also looking at the sequencing and trying to understand like how much, for instance, is about of these cost needs are about wastewater treatment plants, which obviously are important, but for us we would probably try to start with extending coverage and maybe breaking it up in that sense and thinking of what we need in the next 5 years could be a useful way to think of it and also to make it seem more. So I think there is a risk that with these headline figures and assuming that 2030 is doable and that's the time frame we have, it may seem very, very daunting. And I think it's useful to give the sense of the need that there is and the need to prioritize and devote more funds. But I think we also need to provide feasible ways forward. So what can we do possibly in the next 5 years, which is the timelines that many politicians will also have. Thanks.
Okay, many thanks, Andre, for that contribution. And sorry that I put you on the spot, but I realized that you are more focused on issues of sanitation as well. And it was great to hear your voice on this particular occasion. But also many thanks for the point that you raised earlier in the chat. At this point, Katrina, maybe it could be good just to come back to you. There are a couple of other things that you have shared in the chat. I'm not so sure whether you would like to speak to these points as well, if you don't mind.
Sure. So there's Eloise was asking me for more information about what I mentioned on the equitable scorecards. So below there's a link, but now you can't click on it, so that's why I copy pasted. There's a whole section in the UNEC, so that's the European component of the UN, that has all of these documents available on how the scorecard and how to use a scorecard as well. So that all this information is there. And actually maybe it's a request for SWA, because it's the application of one of the principles. Given that there were these 4 countries, so Albania, Senegal, Mali, and Pakistan, that have cited to the WHO report that they are agreeing and consistently following multi-year budget and expenditure frameworks, it would be very nice to understand how they did that and how it looks like, and share that as an inspiration to indeed show that it's not that hard once people get into it. So the difficulty is to start. But as an inspiration for all of us, I think this would be great to have a little bit more documentation on it.
Great. Many thanks, Katrina, and I think you've raised quite an interesting point on that one. Definitely, when we think about the financing options, we can see that we definitely need to look at all the available financing options, and we need to do that if we are needed to address the financing gap that we have for sanitation. But again, on the SWA side, as you have mentioned, we need to have probably everyone of all the constituencies that we have, like in this case, making sure that yes, governments, we have the private sector, the civil society, the learning and research institutions, making sure that we all work together collaboratively, of course, in the interest of the collaborative behaviors, to make sure that we are definitely contributing and playing our roles to address this financing challenge, especially for sanitation. But for sure, we need to mobilize all the partners and making sure that all the external agencies like UNICEF, World Bank, and others, regional banks, the civil society, we definitely work together to make sure that we are able to mobilize each other to support countries in terms of development of the strategies, but also there could be some lessons that we have generated in some other spaces which we definitely can share as well. And I think the partnership could be a better place to make sure that we are able to keep our eyes and ears on the ground and then pull out all those interesting experiences, like even we heard here from Sri Lanka. It's a question of saying what can we learn from Sri Lanka that probably would benefit other countries in the other parts of the world or in other regions as well. So this is something that we have to be looking at a bit more critically as well. I'm not so sure if there are comments. I know I have I know I have colleagues. Probably Eloise. Yes, Eloise, I think you just made a comment. I'm not so sure. Sitali or Amanda, trust me, I'm happy today because on several occasions I've been called Sitali or addressed Sitali. I am happy that I would have all my sins loaded on Sitali, unfortunately. But Sitali was very kind to ask me, Nelson, to really cover him for this particular webinar to moderate. So let's hear the real voice of Sitali, if maybe you have a comment, or any other of the colleagues as well on this particular subject.
Well, Nelson, just to thank Katerina and to everyone, and also the part that I joined, the discussion was really interesting. And as you say, there are things that emerged which we might have to follow up on, some interesting cases that we would follow up and see if we can document better and share. But thank you so much, and it was good to, like you say, to exchange personalities. So thanks, and hoping that definitely will follow up on some of the things that came up. Thanks. Hello, this is Sitali. Not sure you can hear me, but it looks like we might have lost Nelson, or maybe he's on mute.
Trust me, I said volumes and volumes on a muted mic. So forgive me. But anyway, I was saying that it could be good to hear from Katerina, maybe her parting shots. Earlier on, of course, you highlighted areas that we have to look into, but I'm not so sure if you have other things that you'd want to probably leave us with as we come closer to the end of this particular webinar. Something that you really think we should be looking at going forward, Katerina.
I think we all contributed enough, but I think, well, yes, please keep talking about money, keep pushing others to talk about money, ask questions, ask the financial question, call the shots. When there is a new financing mechanism, understand what is the scope of it and what are the conditions that make it applicable. And well, IRC, we have several country offices. We can support you in having some of those discussions, and that's an offer that I also put on the table. Thank you very much for your patience and contributions.
Many thanks, Katrina, and I think I will not repeat what our captain of the ship, Captain Stali, has said, apart from just appreciating the fact that you spared the moment to take us through this quite moving presentation. There are quite a number of issues that definitely we have to look at, and I think we have taken note of this. Just to also thank all of us who joined from our different spaces, our different organizations and countries. I think it was great to have you on the webinar today. And this, I think, is the last webinar in the series of this year. But very soon we'll be looking at maybe a set of webinars to convene next year, and we'll be happy probably in the weeks and months to come to hear from you, probably your feedback, your reflections on how we can improve this particular platform of webinars as a medium for exchanging ideas, exchanging experiences, but also making sure that we are working collaboratively together to address the challenges that we have. And this is to make sure that everyone everywhere has water and sanitation services, but also making sure that, yes, we are following hygiene practices as well. So it's a question of making sure that you continue reflecting on some of these webinars, and also share with us if you have specific ideas that you want us to really probably focus on in the coming months. It will be quite great to hear from you. I also believe that it will be at a stage where we can do a little bit of a reflection on how we have fared in these webinars, and probably look at areas that we have to improve. But at this point in time, I would like just to say thank you so much. If anything, we can give Katrina a big hand for the wonderful presentation. I don't know how webinars, they don't have probably an icon for big hand, but I think I see one here. So a big hand to you, Katrina, and we'll definitely be happy to come back to you for maybe some similar support. The offer that you have given us, we have taken note of it, and I'm sure we'll be following up in the days and weeks to come. Otherwise, ladies and gentlemen, if there are no any further comments, then I think this could be the good point for us to pause for today until when we meet again. Thank you so much.